Gittin Daf Pei Beis Amud Aleph. Cut the apron strings, the shiur le beget. We begin the 9th parak of Gittin, if you can believe that. We've moved through so many fascinating ideas. The shiur today, I'm very grateful, is sponsored by Michael and Glynis Sklar, who live in Modi'in at the moment, honoring the 9th yortzeit of Glynis's mother, Estelle Michelson, Esther Bat Shmuel, who was born in Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was then known, and raised as just an ordinary traditional person. As she died, her last breath was taken saying, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. What a Jew is, raised in Rhodesia in those days, and yet to have the presence of mind and for it to be so important to her, as well as just being a wonderful woman and confidant to so many people. There's an interesting history with Michael and Glynis Sklar. Michael's been a Talmud for many, many years. He's a Talmud of the Matmonim shiur, is one of our group every single day. And some 30-something years ago, Michael came to see me to ask whether he could join our shul in Johannesburg, Ket Torah. And I said, why ours? There are many other shuls. Why do you want to join our shul? And he said, because when I go around to the shuls visiting to try and figure out where we should join, because we're moving into this neighborhood, I always ask the people in the shuls why they think I should join their shul. And Ket Torah is the only shul where nobody had a disparaging word to say about the other shuls. Not one single person had a negative comment about any other shul in Johannesburg, and that's why I went to daven dafka in there. And that meant a lot to me, Michael, and was important. And I hope the same would apply. I think it would apply today as well in KBA, where I daven and teach now, that the same would apply, that nobody would have any disparaging word to say about any other shul in the city. At about that time, a few years before Michael came to see me, prison guards of Victor Verster prison came into Nelson Mandela's cell. This was on December the 13th, 1989. And they came in with a 3-piece suit of clothes, and they instructed him to shower and shave and change into the suit. He was being rushed off Yosef style to Tuynhuys, which was the official residence of the President of South Africa, to have his first meeting with President de Klerk. At that meeting, President de Klerk offered to release him and end apartheid, and the conditions of the ending of apartheid would be black people and white people would still live separately in South Africa, but they would live equally. It would be separate but equal was the idea. In an instant, without hesitating, Nelson Mandela said, absolutely not interested. It's all or nothing. At that point, Nelson Mandela had no idea whether de Klerk would ever come back to him with a better offer. The fact is that 14 months later, he did come with a better offer, which was complete removal of apartheid, unconditional ending of apartheid, and released him from prison. This difference of perspective of President de Klerk and Nelson Mandela as to whether freedom can be given incrementally or it has to be all or nothing is a machlokes Chachomim and Rabbi Eliezer lehavdil in our Mishnah. Let's understand what the machlokes is and how it affects how to understand. The whole machlokes revolves around the one posuk we have been trying to understand for the last 3 months. The whole Masechta has been about one posuk in Kitetze. Ki yikach ish isha v'alav hayayim lo timsachen beinav ki matzav ha'arbat davar. If a person falls out of favor with his wife, or his wife falls out of favor with him and he decides to divorce her, v'chatav la sefer kritut v'natan beyadav v'shilcham b'bito. He writes a sefer kritut, which is a get. Sefer kritut, a sefer that ends the relationship. V'yatza'a mi beito v'alcha beita lish acher. And she leaves his house and she can marry another man. Our Mishnah talks about a situation where the man says, in handing the get over to his wife, here you are, you're now free to marry anybody you want, but for Joe Soap. You can't marry him. But anybody else you want to, you can marry. Machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachomim. Rabbi Eliezer matir. Rabbi Eliezer says it's a good get, and the Chachomim say this get doesn't work. She is still married. The get is invalid. The Gemara discusses what this really means, but for, and discusses the difference between saying but for and saying on condition that. So if he had said, here's your get on condition you don't marry Joe Soap, that would have been a valid get according to everybody. The Gemara concludes, the way the Rif understands the Gemara's conclusion is that would be a valid get. The machlokes, the difference of opinion between the Chachomim and Rabbi Eliezer is where he says, but for. Here's a get that frees you to marry whoever you want, but for Joe Soap. He you can't marry. What's the machlokes about? Says the Gemara, because here, The reason is because shiur la beget, because he has limited the get. There is a difference, says the Gemara, between a conditional get and a limited get. A conditional get means here's a get. It's a completely fine get, as Rashi explains it. But the get is only activated on condition that certain things happen or don't happen. And we know that any agreement, including a get, can be conditional. Here's your get on condition it rains tomorrow. Here's your get on condition it doesn't rain tomorrow. It doesn't matter. Whatever condition you want to put in it, that activates the get. So here he's saying, here's a get for you. It's a complete get. But if you were to marry Joe Soap, the get would be invalid retrospectively. It would never have been a get. In other words, you can't marry Joe Soap. That works. That's a good way to do it if you want to stop her from marrying an individual. But if you were to say, here is the get which frees you to marry anybody you want but for Joe Soap, you're limiting a get. And a get can't be limited. A get means unlimited. So again, that difference is important. The Rashba says, Klomar she'ein ze kritut. The Torah says a sefer kritut. You've got to give her a document that cuts off the relationship, that terminates the relationship. But if you're saying, but for Joe Soap, you're basically saying, when it comes to Joe Soap, you're still my wife. You're an eshet ish for Joe Soap. For everybody else, you're okay, but for Joe Soap, you're a married woman. So that's not a kritut. That's holding on to control. You haven't released control. You haven't relinquished control. We learned the other day of the importance of giving the wife control over her own destiny. That's the gift of the get. And that with all the hardship of the get, with all the sadness and the separation of the get, there's also independence that comes with the get. The Gemara goes on the next page to discuss where we learn this from, and Rabbi Yanai says we learn it from that second pasuk, from pasuk Beis, V'yatzami beito v'acha ve'etal le'ish acher. 2 ways to translate that pasuk, and she will leave his house and go to that other man, implying that even if theoretically he released her only to marry one other man, but everybody else not, if he says, look, I can see you've got a relationship going with this other man, let's get divorced, here's your get, you can marry that man now, but nobody else. Le'ish acher, that seems to be what he's saying. He's releasing her to marry that other man. And therefore the get is valid, which is how Rabbi Eliezer learns it, but the Chachomim learn it. No, hai ish lechol ish v'ish, it means, and she leaves his house and goes to marry any other man. So is it any other man or that other man? A machlokes and understanding that posuk as to whether the get frees her to marry anybody or the get frees her to marry a specific set of people, but not everybody. And that's the whole machlokes that this revolves around. So in understanding the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbanan, I understand Rabbi Eliezer, where Rabbi Eliezer says matir, that the get works. Why does the get work? Because it's a conditional get. What difference does it make? If he says on condition you don't marry, or he says but for, does it really make a difference in how he actually articulates it? It's not the wording inside the get. The get is a perfectly kosher get. It's what he says when he hands it over. So I understand that Rabbi Eliezer says that's a good get. But the Chachomim say absolutely not. Why? Because shiur la beget. He left something over. He limited the get. It wasn't an unconditional get. Not unconditional. It doesn't matter if it's not unconditional. It wasn't an unlimited get. A get has to be unlimited. Where does this come from? Now I refer you back to our shiur on May the 18th, Erev Yom Yerushalayim, which is our first shiur on Gittin, which you no doubt remember very well, because that was the psicha, that was the introduction to the whole Masechta Gittin, where we learned this posuk for the first time. And I brought you a difference in machlokes Onkelos and Targum Yonason as to how to translate the word sefer kritut. If you remember, we've got it down below on the source sheet again. Onkelos says get pturin. This gives her a ptur. And now you know that a ptur is a gift, isn't it? If a person gets a ptur from the army, what does that mean? You don't have to go to the army, you're free. You get a ptur from some obligation. A ptur means you're free. You get a ptur from a mitzvah. If you ask a shaila whether you're obligated to do a certain mitzvah, and they're all saying, no, you're potter. You're free. So ptur is that freedom that comes with it. That's how Onkelos understands sefer kritut. The Targum Yonason says sefer tiruchin. It's a document of separation. So that's interesting. There are different angles of what that sefer kritut means. Targum Yonason says there can't be freedom without separation. And so Targum Yonason will go like the Chachomim, or the Chachomim here will go like Targum Yonason. The get has to be separate. You can't have freedom without separation. And if you're still holding on to something, you can't marry that man because you've been my wife. That means you're still controlling her to some degree. If you hold even limited control over somebody, you haven't given them freedom. It's only theoretical. It's one person in the whole world. You can marry anybody you want in the whole world except for so-and-so. That except for so-and-so means you're still holding some level of control. Says the Targum Yonason, this has to be a sefer tiruchin. It's got to be complete separation. Say the Chachomim, and therefore, that for so-and-so is not separation. You're holding on to the apron string. Whereas the Unkel says it's Pturin, it's a gift of freedom. So I've given you 99.9% freedom. You can marry anybody in the world except one person. It's almost all the freedom. But I've given you a fortune of freedom. When you were married to me, you couldn't be with any other man. Now you can be with any man in the world except that one. That's an amazing opportunity I'm giving you. It's a gift. That's the difference of opinion between President de Klerk and Nelson Mandela. President de Klerk says, I'm giving you 90% of what you want. There's going to be equality. You come out of prison. The ANC is unbanned. Everything's fine. Just one little thing we're holding on to. Separate but equal. Says Nelson Mandela, holding on is the problem. If you're holding on to anything, we don't have any freedom. And it's out of the question. As the Chachomim say here, Lahavdil. If you're holding on to anything with the woman, she doesn't have freedom. And get is about freedom. It's a get pturin. Chachomim learn like Targum Yonason, there can only be ptur, there can only be real freedom if there is teruchin, if there's a complete separation. And that's a very important principle to understand and to appreciate, not only when you're giving somebody freedom, to understand that you don't have conditions, you don't give somebody, empower somebody and attach a whole lot of conditions to their empowerment, because then you haven't empowered them. You say to somebody, I'm putting you in charge of this division. You're completely accountable for it. It's your division. There are a few things you need to know. This, you got to do this. You can't hire that person. You have to hire that person. It's over. That's not empowerment. You haven't given the person the opportunity. The only way you can give them a fair opportunity is to be able to say, it's yours. Do it as you want. And I accept you'll do it differently. I'm letting go. It doesn't matter. It's okay. I'm releasing control of this. It's yours to control the way you want to control it. Unless you're able to do that, you're still holding. You're not letting the person go. You're not setting the person up for success because you're still keeping control. One has to be able to let it go. One has to be able to let go of life sometimes. One has to be able to let things happen, not try and control everything, even if you just try and control it a little bit sometimes. To let the outcome. We've got to do our little bit, as we often say. We've got to make our ishtadlus. You can't control the outcome. You've got to leave that to the Rebbeinu Shalom. But it's equally important if you are the person seeking the freedom. You've got many, many situations where a person has a job. A person has a job, he's an eved. He has servitude. He's working for a balabos. He's working for a master. He wants freedom. He wants to become an entrepreneur. So he makes an arrangement with his company that he can work for them part-time, and they'll give him a contract so that when he goes off and does his own thing, at least he's got a safety net, that he's got some income coming. That's not freedom. You've got to be able to cut the safety net and say, I'm on my own. I'm taking the risks of being on my own. I'm having the freedom of being on my own. Until you're able to take that step, you're not on your own. I often talk about the image of a trapeze artist who has to let go of the one bar before he can catch the other. And in the middle, there's a terrifying moment where he's holding neither bar. But if he's not willing to be suspended in that moment for a moment, he'll never transfer to the second bar. And we often want to transfer to the second bar, but we want to keep holding the first bar. Doesn't work. Say the Chachomim, that's not called Pturim, that's not called freedom, that's not called letting go, that's not called Kritut. When you want to be free, if you want to be free, cut the strings, cut yourself loose. And yes, you'll be in that terrifying moment of what will happen and will it be okay, and you don't know. That's the bitochen, that's the trust you've got to have, a trust in yourself and a trust in the Rebbeinu Shalom. If you're not willing to trust yourself and Hashem enough to let go, you don't deserve the siyata dishmaya of success as a free person. Freedom requires the willingness to let go. If you're freeing somebody else, you've got to let them go. If you're freeing yourself, you've got to let yourself go, and therefore find yourself in a new reality, in a new place of being, where in fact you are responsible for your own destiny and you have acquired kritut from what was before. You've cut yourself off from your old reality and opened countless opportunities and possibilities for a new reality, possibilities which would have been closed to you if you still clutched to the old with one hand while you half-heartedly explored the new.